The Energy Transition Podcast takes you directly into the cutting edge of the global energy sector shift, with a specific focus on the critical role played by oil and gas, as well as the pathways developing around a lower carbon future. Your host, Dan Pickering, founder of Pickering Energy Partners, is joined by Josh Lowrey, president of Upright Digital. Each episode engages industry thought leaders in an exploration of market-moving trends and topics, including new technologies, ESG, capital markets, inclusion and diversity, workforce innovation, regulatory influence, and the voice of the people. Join us as the Energy Transition Podcast looks at the state of the traditional energy and oilfield service sectors, emerging technologies, and the path ahead in a world of lower carbon energy development.
Welcome to the Energy and Transition Podcast. My name is Josh Lowrey. We are coming to you live from the Upright Digital Studios at Pickering and Associates Studio in Memorial area. I'm joined as always with the co-host extraordinaire, Mr. Dan Pickering. How are you, sir?
Life is good, Josh. I am glad to be here. We got a fun hour in front of us.
We do. Before we get going, how have you been? You been busy?
Life's good. You know, I had in the category of things you never thought you'd be doing, I went to my kindergartner's school today for lunch, which starts at 10:50 in the morning, by the way.
Perfect lunchtime.
It's practically a late breakfast. But if 10 years ago you'd asked me, would I be going to have lunch with a kindergartner, I would have said 99% unlikely. And instead, it was 100% likely. And it was a blast.
I love it.
The joy of kindergartners. I tell you, we should all be so happy.
Oh, I'm telling you, Dad shows up. That's a great deal. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good way to start this podcast.
It is.
So this is a busy week in Houston area. There's NAPE going on this week. There's the FRAC conference is going on this week. There's a lot of just activity in the news. I'm sure you are extremely busy just keeping up with all that stuff. So we're going to have lots to talk about with just general oil and gas energy business. I had a little bit of time with our guest here before we had a couple of espressos. So I've loaded him up. So he's going to join me on hopefully the hyperactive train over here that I'm always on. But
Yes.
do you want to give us an introduction to our guest today?
I will, but I think the one heads up, I guess, is if you normally listen to this at 2 times speed and you guys have both had 2 espressos, you better slow it down to at least normal speed. So
We make no promises.
we'll still be going fast. So Justin Edmiston, great to see you. Justin is at DTE Energy, where he is the Director, Growth and Acquisitions.
Right.
And so I got to meet Justin earlier this year and late last year, and found him to be a super smart guy. So we twisted his arm for a podcast. But Justin, will start by telling the folks at home, if you're dual screening this and want to know more about DTE Energy, it is www.dte and
Yep.
then energy.
Yep.
Or
.com.
I believe also DTE.com as well.
Perfect. So if folks want to follow along at home, but Justin, to kick us off, tell us a little bit about you, your background and history, and how'd you get here?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again, guys, for inviting me here today. This is a fantastic program.
Will be fun.
Yeah, a little bit of my background. So I'm actually from Houston. I do live in Detroit now. I'm working for DTE in Michigan. I am originally from Houston. I was born here and moved, about 5 or 6 years old to Oklahoma. So spent some time in Oklahoma until I'd say early adulthood, where I moved back to Houston for work. So I'd say my first 30 years of life, half Oklahoma, half Houston. Fun fact of where I'm from in Oklahoma, I went to Sapulpa High School and graduated there. So I don't know if you've seen like the latest Twister movie. I think it's supposed to be set in Sapulpa. So
Oh, really?
yeah. So,
Okay.
in case you're wondering, yes, I have seen lots of Twister.
Your family survived.
Yes. So my background, so I went to the University of Oklahoma, focused mostly on finance.
Okay.
From there, like I mentioned, moved to Houston, worked for BP for a number of years in the North American Gas and Power Group. Focused mostly on trading and origination. Did that for a number of years, and eventually decided to go back to grad school. Sort of catalyst was that BP had a nasty oil spill in the Gulf. So you can imagine a trading shop doesn't have very good credit during that period. So kind of reevaluated what I wanted to do. So ultimately decided to go to Harvard to pick up an MBA.
Casual casual humble drags there.
Though versus I went to school in Boston.
Yes.
So thank you.
Yeah, I usually only go. It's like
Well done. For those I was
Cambridge,
couldn't get into Harvard, we're very jealous and appreciative. Anyway,
of course.
HBS
Has lowered their standards.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, great program. Left there to go do management consulting for Schlumberger for a few years. Mostly focused on upstream work. So had a lot of good experiences there. From there, ultimately decided to jump off and go directly into the upstream industry. Working for a portco for First Reserve. They had big upstream funds at the times. That was interesting ride. We took the company through bankruptcy twice in 1 year, so we did the infamous Chapter 22.
Wow.
So that was an interesting experience. But great group of folks. In that upstream community. I know a lot of them are here for NAPE this week.
Right.
But ultimately, I saw the writing on the wall around, call it 2021, 2022, when we saw gas prices reaction to the war in Ukraine. We'd had such low gas prices. It's a mature commoditized business at this point. But seeing Ukraine come in, kick up gas prices because of the LNG exports and the anticipation of, Nord Stream being, detonated and sabotaged.
Right.
Seeing those markets and the gas prices kick up to almost double digits over a couple months period and then fall back down with no resiliency to a global catalyst like that kind of indicated to me that, hey, gas markets are very mature at this point. And if you can't sustain, prices given a global catastrophe that's, created, 10, 15 BCF of demand overnight, then maybe that's not the right market, right environment for me to continue in. So kind of reevaluated what I wanted to do. And ultimately I'd worked with DTE quite a few times. So I knew a lot of folks over there, liked the industry and kind of saw the writing on the wall of utilities they're about to go through. And we're going through now really interesting transitions, right? With, the transition to green energy, challenges around resiliencies, weather patterns, data center load growth. Like it's a really interesting environment to be in right now. So ultimately took a job as director of corporate strategy over at DTE. So, tackling a lot of these problems and focused on a lot of this stuff and got really involved in a lot of the growth, a lot of the data center work. And ultimately moved into this new position we've created called growth and acquisitions. It's really focused on inorganic and organic growth within, mostly the electric company, but, driving these sort of accretive, strategic, long-term investments that can really, dig in and help our company grow, focused on customer affordability, as well as helping our customers hit our net zero objectives. So really interesting place to be in right now.
Yeah. Wow. So you joined how long ago?
Just the tail end of 2022. So
Okay.
just
You've
over
been there
2 years. So
2 years.
Yep.
So 2 years ago, could you see this data center thing starting to happen? Or was it really more about the net zero renewables, shifting power mix, et cetera, or shifting fuel mix?
Yeah, exactly. So we were really focused on, hey, how do we accelerate net zero, build out, this army of renewables? Like how do we hit these goals and help our customers, reach those goals too? But it's been a long journey for the data center. So I'd say 2 years ago, we just, my partner in crime, who's the economic development director at the time, started getting these phone calls from data centers about 2 years, maybe 18 months ago. Interested in Michigan because he had actually worked. He's got an interesting background. He used to be prosecutor. He was the chief administrator for Wayne County, Detroit.
Oh, wow.
And he had helped push some legislation forward for sales and tax use exemptions for data centers. So that was a very long journey for that. But he was sort of the interstitial there. Started getting calls from the data centers like, hey, I'm interested in your backyard. Let's look at some sites. So that kind of kicked off our journey that took, maybe 14 months of trying to organize the company around how do we serve data centers, how do we protect our customers, how do we lean in for customer affordability and do all the nice things, without, upsetting the apple cart, with these guys coming in. So I would say we did not see the data centers coming. We started, hearing, word on the street. We got the sales and use tax exemption, and now we're in this different world where, hey, this stuff is coming. You look at some projections from like BCG or Bain or some of the other folks, like they're estimating 35 gigawatts by 2030 of just data center growth alone, right?
And
So
that's
monumental amount.
Monumental.
Yeah, but put that in context for us. I mean, what's 35 gigawatts on top of how many gigawatts today?
Oh, of existing?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good question. I don't remember the charts exactly, but it's a pretty staggering amount, right?
Yeah, I mean we're doubling or more.
Yeah, exactly.
Obviously.
Yeah, I think the growth rate, that's a run rate of like 20% growth rate year on year. So if you back the math out of that.
So we're growing quickly in that area, but let's let's step back before we do the data centers, because we can and will take a lot of time on data centers, don't you think, Josh?
I mean, it's one of the cooler things out there.
Yeah. So kind of the world thinks about utilities as fairly sleepy, and you just talked about, 6 or 8% growth, I think, is in your corporate presentations per year. And so, I mean, these businesses are growing faster than upstream businesses. Upstream companies don't want to grow volumes, more than 1 or 2%. So, I mean, you're now growing faster than oil and gas businesses, which is kind of interesting. How's it all happening? I get the data centers are part of it, but it's got to be more than that, or it was more than that before the data centers came onto the playing field.
Yeah, it's a very complicated opportunity. I won't say problem, opportunity. Maybe I'll talk a little bit more broadly about growth for the utility industry,
Yeah.
as a whole. But I will bring something up. A couple days ago, my kid came home. And, he has these jokes he learns at school, and he had one in particular that kind of resonated. I kind of self-identified a little bit. But I'll ask you, Dan. What do you call a penguin in the Sahara Desert?
I don't know. What do you call it, Justin?
You call him lost.
Okay.
So I kind of self-identify with that when I was thinking about, more the greater context of growth in Michigan in my role, right? So, I do feel a little bit like a penguin. I think, all of us focus on growth too, because Michigan is not a growing state. If you look, the past 30, 40, 50 years, it's been significant decline. You've lost its manufacturing base. Obviously, it's got, great automotive industry, but that's been a roller coaster too, right? So you think about growth in the context of, this will all make sense here in a minute, the context of Michigan, there's not a lot of load growth and a lot of, vibrant activity. So it's a really challenging space to step into to kind of figure out how do we grow in that environment. So with that context, we'll talk about a little bit broader on the utility industry as a whole and kind of like work backwards towards that. So if you look at the utilities, kind of if you kind of canvas the large public electric utilities that have EPS targets, they're kind of all in the range of 6 to 8%, right?
Okay.
So if you dig into that and actually ask the question, what is that growth, right? Is it more load? Maybe in some kind of context of a data center, but the best way I like to look at it is, what does the CapEx look like for the next 5 years? And you stack that up and ask, okay, where's it going, right? So if you think about electric company, the business model. So if you look at that CapEx, and S&P Capital has a really good program here that kind of lays all that stuff out. I'll reference it. But if you look at that stack over the next 3-4 years, that CapEx is going to grow to about $200 billion per year annum deployment. If you look 10 years ago, that was around just under $80 billion. So there's a tremendous amount of capital being spent. And if you double click on that stack and look at it, obviously there's distribution and transmission investments. Reliability is an issue with the changing weather patterns. But if you look more broadly at that stack, there's a tremendous amount of investment that's going into renewables. As we're force marching this retirement of coal and in some instances gas, you got to move to something else, right? And it's a tremendous amount of investment in the renewables and these clean energies. And then you have to ask the question, okay, who's paying for that, right? So if you look at that, so you're basically increasing the numerator of the cost of CapEx to your rate base without really increasing the denominator, which is the amount of load you have in these areas, right? So you have to.
So you're spending more money on the same amount of people.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right. So you have to think about that as an affordability problem, right? So either one of two things could probably happen here. Like, okay, are these guys going to have to eventually blink on their 6 to 8% EPS targets? Or are we just going to continue to see affordability sort of get pressured as we sort of transition these over to renewables?
Which is another way of saying utility bills go up
Exactly.
to pay for
Right.
the more renewable, cleaner base.
Right. If you look at, there's some good articles from, I think Bloomberg had a good article on Con Ed. They were seeing double-digit rate increases that are just going to continue indefinitely. So you have to ask the question, okay, what is the challenge here? Obviously, you want to keep maintain your EPS targets and your growth rates, but you can't just do it on the backs of your customers, right? So that's a huge theme for us, especially in Michigan, is that, our objective here is to, how can we grow, our business without impacting our customers?
And did you already mention where your customer base is? I mean, I know you're up in Michigan, but what is?
Yeah, so we're split a little bit. We're basically the greater Detroit area. We've got about 2.3 million electric customers.
Okay.
And then our regulated gas business is sort of like flip-flopped on the top part of the state, northwest part of the state, where we serve our gas customers.
Okay.
So, yep. So if we think about growth, we think about how can we grow without impacting our customers? What are the levers to do that? And it's a complicated conundrum, right? So, obviously, rates are really important for our customers. So our group is kind of looking at, where are the areas that we can do this? Is it new products and services, data centers included? Is it things like resiliency as a service for C&I, commercial, industrial customers? Is it vertical integration where we can sort of lean into to having a better business model and spend more money, in Michigan, in our constituents' backyards? Is it, acquisitions of generating assets, that have a good footprint in our area that we can use on a regulated, unregulated basis? Or is it, your typical M&A activity where we kind of like look at standalone businesses and, hey, does this business have a long-term competitive strategic advantage for our customers? Is it going to solve problems that they're going to have down the road? Are there investments that we could put capital to work that isn't directly relying on our rate base? So that's sort of the objective that we have. So we've recognized this problem in the EPS and the earnings growth and the customer affordability, and that's what we're actively working on.
Yeah. So Justin, if I recap what you said, you, just like every company, you want to grow earnings. One way to do that is spend more money that your customers have to pay more for. That doesn't sound attractive. You don't want people pounding on the door saying they don't like their bill. So you got to look into other spots.
Right.
And so that sounds like a fun job. And then I guess all of a sudden here comes this new demand center potentially of data centers. So, I mean, let's talk. Can we dive into that now?
Yeah.
We held off 8 minutes or something like that. But
Well,
yes, here comes the data center.
at 11 minutes.
Yeah, there we go. So obviously everybody wants to talk about it. Should we be? Is it a big deal? And if it is a big deal, let's kind of try to put it in context.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the data centers is a phenomenal opportunity for the state of Michigan. Like I mentioned before, we have slim pickings for growth opportunities here. There's arguments that data centers don't create a lot of jobs, but we've done some analysis on it. We've looked at, there's some campuses being built in Ohio. We kind of look towards those and ask the question like, okay, how many jobs does this really create? And if you go down there and you observe it, there's maybe 3,000 or 4,000, construction workers, and they've been there
People
for
working. Yeah.
5, 6, 7 years, and they're probably going to be there for another 10 years.
Okay.
So there's quite a bit of jobs that this stuff does create, but granted, when they're steady run rate, there's a lot less folks at the facilities running these things, but they're really good economic engines. And something that we see as a good economic benefit for the state. So in terms of DTE, we do have a lot of interest in the data centers right now coming into our service territory. Like I mentioned, we got the sales and use tax exemption.
Spend one more minute on that, though.
Yeah.
What's that mean? It basically means a lower tax rate.
Yes, exactly. So it's actually an interesting conundrum, but if you have a sales and tax use exemption, that allows you not to have to pay sales tax on the equipment that you're putting inside of the data center. So if you think about a data center, call it a 100 megawatt data center, may have something like $3 to $5 billion worth of equipment inside of it. So if you have a sales and tax use exemption, you're saving 6% on that equipment within the data center, and
From the get-go.
at
the front end.
right? And they refresh it every 3 to 4 years, depending on what their product life cycles are, what's inside there. So you're looking at a tremendous amount of money. On the other side of this, there's an argument that like, hey, that's 6% of revenues that the state would have.
$180 million.
Exactly, but then you can argue, well, they wouldn't be there to begin with if you didn't have the sales and tax use exemption, right? So a little bit of conundrum there, but it's very meaningful.
So you got a tax advantage to look in Michigan.
Right. And there's only about 18 states, and the ones that did have sales and tax use exemptions have been passed quite a bit ago, and they're sort of saturated with data centers at this point. So there's not a lot of locations that have the sales and tax use exemption, and then a lot of capacity within the state, which is one of the advantages that we have as well. Like I mentioned,
Talk about that capacity.
right? So we have excess capacity in terms of we have more generation than we have load, and this is a result of we kind of talked about this in the beginning about the state of Michigan's been losing. It's been declining. We've been losing commercial industrial customers for a long time. So there's this natural load that's freed up as we lost customers over time. And then the other piece is that we are this is public. It's in our integrated resource planning, but we're ramping up a lot of renewables in order to retire some coal plants. That's part of our net zero goal, as well as alignment with our commission and the clean energy legislation that's been passed in the state of Michigan to kind of move away from coal. So we've been building up and ramping up renewables in advance of that, which also gives us some more gunpowder for excess capacity within our service territory.
I mean, Michigan itself gets a lot of attention politically. So there's a lot of people always looking at how can they help the state of, the heartbeat of America, if you will, right? So I'm sure that they're looking for ways to give, you know, opportunity zones in areas where they can increase growth. I mean, Michigan itself, though, is growing. There's people, are people not coming back into the Detroit area this last year? Maybe I'm missing that. I know that there was like a 50-year decline in population, and maybe the last 2 have been the years where there's been some kind of bounce back positive. Not to the extent of where it was, but you're getting more people back, so some of it's working.
Yeah, there's growth in some areas, but if you look at the overall trend, and we've had some of our fundies folks look at this stuff, and they're losing youth in the state. So, we're educating, paying for, these kids to go to U of M in Michigan, and then they leave the states. So, it's an overall trend that's kind of alarming,
Yeah.
to an extent. It's something that we've been trying to think about, how's DTE's role here? How can we help drive growth in the state? And that's some of the stuff we're actively looking at.
By the way, to their credit, their website is excellent on that. You guys are doing a lot in the community. We don't want to talk too much about it right now, but you guys are doing a lot with the community and growth and lots of programs. So I commend DT for doing what they're doing up there, because they're certainly doing their fair share. I guess the best way to say it.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, we are focused on driving, being an economic vehicle in the communities in which we serve. So that's a big part of our.
Clear, you guys are doing that. It's great.
Yep.
So I heard you say you've got capacity and you've got clean capacity. And so what's that translate to? I assume that translates to potentially speed for putting, we hear a lot about data centers and what they care about. What do you think data centers care about? And then we'll circle back to how you guys fit that, or why you're winning stuff, if you will.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Like we mentioned, obviously they care about the sales and use tax exemption. That's table stakes for them, right? They also need capacity. They want it yesterday. So if you have available capacity, it's something that's, attractive to the data centers. I will say though, just having available capacity doesn't mean the data centers are going to, it's not like if you build it, they'll come kind of thing. There is a relationship building piece that they need to feel there's certainty and trust, wherever, new area that they're moving. Michigan doesn't have an existing data center community. There's one unit over on the west side that switch is installed a number of years ago, switch the co-locator. But we really don't have a community of data centers in the state. So I think, as they come in, they obviously got to have sales and use tax exemption. They got to have a pathway to be energized, but they also have to feel like
It's energized, meaning literally
plugged in and getting power, right? Yeah, exactly right. So, and there's some complications around that, like, okay, how long does it take for them to hook up into transmission and, build a substation so they can actually get powered? That's another piece that's really important to them as well. But it's really bringing all three of these things together, having the right partner, having excess available capacity that's, in some instances very, very clean, which is really important to them. And to be able to, to have line of sight to be able to get plugged in and going. Speed is really, really, really important to these guys. I think there's a battle for market share, 2026, 2027 are some of the years that these guys are really, really interested in getting their buildings up and running. But again, that's not to say, like, if you look back and, what's happened today, you look at this AI market that's just sort of exploded. It's only like 18, 19 months old. And now we're talking, we're moving from a conversation of these data centers being 50 megawatts, 100 megawatts. We're now having conversations of like, oh, I want a gigawatt location, gigawatt plus location, because I want to scale up to this new AI sort of new products. Whereas before they may have said like, hey, I want 3, cloud-based redundancy sort of patterns. But now they're talking about having all the compute done, for AI and some of these products in one location and scaling them up. So it's a completely different way of thinking and you think about it's only been 18 months, right? It's crazy. Now we're talking about investments in generation, things that are assets that are going to be 30, 40-year life cycles based on, an industry that's only 18 months or so now. So incredible conversations we're having now.
Just help everybody think through, what's a gigawatt cost? What's a gigawatt data center cost?
So I'll kind of touch on this 2 ways. Like, okay, if you wanted to build it today, how much would that cost?
Yeah.
So a gigawatt of electricity is a significant investment. You're talking billions of dollars, whether it's a giant combined cycle gas turbine plant that can cost a couple $1 billion, or, is it a gigawatt worth of solar or wind, which is a tremendous amount of solar panels and wind that can cost a couple $1 billion as well. But if you think about the load these data centers are going to be running on. They're going to be really high load factors. Are going to be running about 90% of the time. Is sort of the finger in the air there. So if you think about running 90% of the time, 24/7, 365, and you think about, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of how much electricity costs? So if you just putting a finger in the air, if you call it $70 a megawatt, which is a good finger in the air for industrial load rate. And you play those numbers out and you ask the question like, okay, well, how much is a gigawatt worth of power every year? That's roughly just over $500 million per year just for your electric bill. So staggering, right? And you think about, okay, this is an industry that's 18 months old, and now you're talking about assets for 40 years and 30-year contracts with these guys and for $500 million worth of electricity per year. Just the amount of numbers we're throwing around are just staggering. So incredible conversations. But yeah, it's been an interesting journey.
Yeah. And DTE has signed a gigawatt LOE, right? And talk to us about the switch announcement.
Yeah, so we announced a 1.3 or 1.4-ish gigawatt agreement with Switch, backed by a hyperscaler. It's been an interesting journey for us. We're excited about the partnership. I think it's going to be the first step in us making this real for us. Again, it's its early stages, so we're still working through, what does this look like? This is really new to DTE. Like I said, I'm a penguin right now. Like we're not used to growing.
I
So
love it. The penguin. Yeah.
yeah. So we got to think through like, okay, like what does that look like? It's great to sign up with them, but we want to be a really good partner. We want to make sure we've got the right assets for them. We're promising them, we're going together, with trust and transparency. And how do we, create a new industry within the state that doesn't really exist or isn't used to growing? So there's a lot of challenges around that.
With respect to that, that's a great analogy, really. It feels like everybody's in that position, though, at some level, right? Not just you guys. With this, I mean, everybody is probably having these internal conversations.
Yeah, and I think it is somewhat of a well-trodden path already for bringing in data centers and serving the load, but maybe not at this gigawatt scale at this point. But if you think historically in data centers, they first came in when they first started building data centers. They came into the utilities, and utilities had these like economic development rates because they were able to sell a little bit of excess capacity, and it was great. Have the data center come in and help optimize their gas plant or whatever assets they had. So they all came in and they started growing and eating up these economic development rates, which ultimately had impacts on customer affordability because you're selling them discount power, right?
So what you're saying, the original data center, and this wouldn't be the ones we're talking about today. They're smaller, but you're saying they get cheap power, but then all of a sudden they start using more of it. And now all of a sudden we've eaten through the capacity. We got to have new capacity. We got to spend money on it.
Right.
All of a sudden retail guys are paying for data center customers.
Exactly. And we're in a lucky enough space where we can see that's happened. And how do we avoid that? And how do we make sure we've got the right guardrails? This is a good thing for the state, a good thing for our customers. So we've got a lot of foresight around that we're working through. So that's really our focus here is how do we become the best partners for, these hyperscalers and folks coming in? How do we make sure our customers are protected? And this is a good benefit for affordability.
So that's, I guess, as you see this playing out, whether it's in Michigan or elsewhere, the days of getting the sneaky cheap prices on the back of the individuals is gone, and everybody's smartened up on that. And so if Amazon's going to build a data center, Amazon's paying for the power.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think the hyperscalers and the big data centers are coming around. They realize that, hey, this is, we can't keep coming in with these cheap economic development rates. I think there was some early, thoughts from the data centers that like, hey, I can do the utility business better than utilities. And, I think probably anyone could, but there's a low bar for utilities. But I think they realized, you saw the AWS deal for the power plant. I forget where it was, in Pennsylvania, I think, or the nuclear power plant they were signing up for a partnership with through an IPP, or the Talon deal through an IPP. And then you see, all these interveners come in and kind of like blow that deal up because of the nature of the utility business. I think they're realizing like, hey, we need to work with the utilities. It makes sense. This isn't a business they want to get into. So I think there's a lot of nuances there. Like, hey, we all want to be good partners in this and make sure we all, we're all stacking hands and we're meeting the right goals for customers, for energization timelines, for the vision of what this could look like.
One of the things you said was 90% uptime for these data centers. I've heard folks say 99.999%. Is that there's a disconnect there because there's a big difference between must run all the time to 90%.
Yeah, I think you're probably thinking of two different things. One, I was referring to the load factor, how much of their capacity they're running at constantly. That 9.9999 or the nth degree you're hearing is typically for the reliability of it. Like how reliable is that uptime going to be, and that's whether the utility has redundancy in terms of serving them. They have backup generation on site, backup batteries on site, or whatever the form that backup takes that can kinda get them to that 9.999999, which is sort of the reliability that they sell for their products, which kind of influences what products they have and what the markets are for it. So, but that is a good point. Reliability is important, and there's some challenges here too. We think about like how do we create this reliability, and I think right now there's this tremendous amount of diesel-fired backup generation on site for these things. They're typically at least 100% matching. So these things are gargantuan diesel generators, and they're just monstrosities. So that's some of the other challenges we're thinking through is like, how do we help them, move away from that diesel generation? But it is a challenge to find something that can have a hot start as fast as that to give them 9.9999 nth degree, right? So
All sorts of different challenges. It's a good segue to this discussion of how important in this data center world, how important is clean versus soon? So, we hear a lot of discussion in the markets about, well, natural gas is,
I like your words on your notes better.
what did I say?
You say fast
Yeah.
versus soon. I mean, it really does feel like now, and because soon is out there, but
Okay.
like I'm being
Yeah.
somewhat,
Yeah.
but because I mean, it does feel like, to your point, 18 months, we are moving so quickly. So is clean getting lost isn't the right word, but to his point, how important is clean versus fast?
yeah, I think there's certainly both incredibly important. I think we're luckily we're in a good spot with our clean energy legislation in the state, and our goals kind of align with that clean vision that a lot of these hyperscalers and data centers have. Um, certainly they want to get energized as fast as possible. So I think there is some appetite that, okay, maybe it's not perfect today. Maybe it's, something that's cool for a couple years until you retire it, or there's some flexibility there. But ultimately they all have objectives by, 2030, 2035, whatever their net zero objectives are, that needs to align to a transition to cleaner stuff, which is a challenge because all the clean stuff other than nuclear is a lot of intermittency on it, right? So you look at solar and wind, and how do you run a 24/7 1 gigawatt data center on solar and wind? Yes, you can start throwing batteries at it, but it's complicated, right? So it's a major challenge. Like, how do we get to this clean world? But it's certainly, yes, they obviously want to get, speed to market is critical, but they really just need a pathway to like, hey, how are we going to get there, and how are we going to work together? And this goes back to the transparency. What are the asset stacks that we have? What does our development pipeline look like? What is the electricity going to look like, 5, 10 years from now? How can we align that, right?
So speed's important. Sounds like ultimately being clean over time is also really important. But measuring that, it's interesting. We're measuring things in months as it relates to getting started, and years in terms of getting to where we need to be or want to be.
Which that kind of follows with some of the things we've heard on this podcast, is that, yeah, it's important to be clean, but we need this right now.
Yeah. Fast.
Yes, yesterday, right?
Yes. Yeah. Clean, fast, soon. Right. Exactly. We'll hit nuke in just a minute because I think that's an interesting discussion. How do you put this? Did this all change with this DeepSeek thing that got announced for a week ago? Literally, I guess a week and a day ago. So 8 days ago, the world seemed like it changed with this DeepSeek announcement. It obviously matters to you because does it mean we need fewer data centers or different data centers, or does it mean nothing? Give us your expert opinion.
Yeah, I'd say so. Like, immediate reaction to it was probably, hey, it's probably one of two things. One, hey, we're talking about this 18-month-old, business. It's, the most advanced thing that's ever happened. So are the, efficiency improvement asset, cycle timelines just really fast now, and it's just like really evolving this quick, and is it real? versus, sort of the thought like, okay, that's coming out of China. Like, how much can you trust? Like, right, what is really the case here? Is it all political? So that's sort of my first reaction. I think a lot of us had the same reaction. To your point, hey, if this is a real efficiency gain, like, does this eliminate the demand that we're forecasting? So let's say two things there. One, so I mentioned that 35 gigawatts earlier.
Yeah.
I think Bain came out, or Bain or BCG, whoever wrote it, came out and said like, no, guys, this is not impacted by this news from DeepSeek because we've already baked in this efficiency expectation, right? So I think there's already expectation is going to get more efficient, and then I'll go back to early data center conversations we had. One of the things we asked is, hey, if you're going to come in, let's say build a 100 megawatt data center plant, are you going to get more efficient over time? Is that going to turn to 80 megawatts, 50 megawatts, 3-4 years from now, and I just built up, or gave you some, excess capacity that I have? And the answer was resoundingly no. We're just going to, we're going to shove 10 pounds of sugar in the 5-pound bag. We're just going to pack the gear into the facility just to use up as much as we can, right? So, and I think you go back to, I think his name was Jevon. I don't know if there's some point it was going to get brought up, right?
Yeah.
18th century British economist, I think. I'm probably going to butcher this, but I can't remember if I remember the quote correctly. It's a very confusing quote. I think its quote is
Perfect.
It is a confusion of ideas to suppose that efficiency, the efficiency of a fuel source is not diminished with increased consumption.
Sounds like a classic British statement.
Yeah, it's a brilliant recall of it.
So yes. What does that mean? What does that mean in Justin's words?
That means, the more efficient something gets, it's not like you're going to use less of it. I think the idea is that, in fact, just to the contrary, the more efficient it gets, the more you use of it. Right? So I think that's the principle that's been thrown around, what
Right.
this is going to
My cell phone capacity would be a good example of that.
Yeah, exactly. And then to just kind of recap on the DeepSeek thing, I think now that we've sort of seen this, after action reviews and kind of like dug in, like, okay, what exactly happened? We've learned that, okay, yes, they were using NVIDIA cards. They were just, not the latest gen. 2, there's some questions around like, okay, what did they actually kind of like steal technology from OpenAI, in the development? And then there is a novel piece here embedded in it where they actually did have some novel advancements where you look at how they train the model and use the model. They're using, eliminating data redundancies. They're making it cleaner, faster. They're reducing the amount of inferences and parameters that are being run. So they're actually kind of optimizing what the actual AI is sort of doing in terms of the technology and the amount of resources it's using. So I think that is a novel approach that is kind of real here. But again, I don't know if that's the breakthrough that everyone thought it was in day one when it came out, right?
So if we boiled that down, your phone didn't stop ringing on Tuesday after DeepSeek stuff happened on Monday.
No, it didn't. In conversations with the pipeline and data centers, is that first it was like, hey, no, don't worry, we still want your generation.
That's
Don't
what
stop
the
anything.
customers said.
Yeah, the customers are saying that, so don't stop. And we think, if anything, this is going to create more demand. This is the first volley of the sort of AI political race war with China that we're going to expect to kind of accelerate, right?
You did an excellent job on the quote, by the way. It is a confusion of ideas to suppose that the economical use of fuel is equivalent to diminished consumption. The very contrary is the truth. Well, that's well done.
For pulling that out.
I'm surprised. Yeah, it is a confusing quote. Yes.
Yes.
Like you said, it's spoken like a
Right now, the people listening to this podcast just spiked the lookup of that quote for sure. Do you think, back to your customers and what they're doing, if they're talking to you about a project, how many other people do you think they're talking to about the same project?
That's a great question.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So, when we talk to some of these bigger hyperscalers, they say like, okay, yeah, I'm talking to 20 other utilities, right? So you have to think like, okay, if they're all looking for 1 gigawatt projects and they're talking to every utility, those utilities are then, turning tail and running back to investors and like saying, oh, I've got, 1 gigawatt here, or 2 gigawatts here, and you stack it all up and it's got to be like 2 or 3 times what the actual demand is out there, right?
Yeah.
So, how do you wade through that? But I think for us, we've approached this conversation where like, not like a nice horse where you saw them. I think their rate base is a couple gigawatts of load, but they've announced something like 9 gigawatts of commitments with data centers.
Okay.
And then so they're going to turn around and somehow like, source enough generation to sort of feed that pipeline. So I think that's a good example. Whereas, us at DT, we're just making sure like, hey, we dotted every single T, and crossed every single I to make sure we've got the generation to support this load ramp. This load ramp is real. We can deliver on it. We've got contingency plans. We've got options. We've got all sorts of different ways to serve this load.
Yeah.
Versus sort of, hanging your hat on a big number and trotting out to Wall Street. So I think Wall Street's getting smart on that. A lot of people are getting smarter on that. But again, like this is a little bit of a well-trodden path that we've got a lot of mistakes that we've seen to learn from along the way. And obviously we're not perfect, but this is one thing that we're trying to get right.
Right. So you said NiSource is 2, talking about adding 9. Size DTE for us?
So we're I'd say about 11 gigawatts peak.
Okay.
Hopefully not butchering that, but yeah, so it's a decent size. That's when we're fully running meters. Hot summer day.
Okay. So you're 11, and tell us just a little bit about. I mentioned the switch contract. I mean, tell us just a little bit about the things that you're doing in this space. You've announced a few things, and so there's the conceptual data center project, but then there's the actual, you guys are doing things. What's the practical successes that you've had?
Yeah, I think it's really understanding how we can serve this load and get folks into our service territory and comfortable. I think there's a lot of things that we talked about, a lot of stuff that data centers value. It's speed to market, it's certainty, it's knowing, exactly how am I going to get energized. It's what's going to be used to serve me. How clean is that? And I think
so it's not enough for you to say, trust us, it'll be there. You're walking them through
exactly
this facility, that facility.
Right. Here's our development pipeline. Here's the projects we have that are coming online. Here's our
No overselling. Doesn't feel like.
no, exactly right. And then part of my role is like, how do we go faster once we figure this out? Like, how do we pull forward renewables acceleration? And how do we make sure that we've got enough in our development pipeline? We've got the right asset mix to serve this stuff. Do we have the right programs and tariff structures and things like that in place? So
here's a dumb question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Let's say you at DT are just great on convincing people that you understand this business and you're good partners, etc. Can you pull power in from other service territory, from other, can you import power, if you will, because you've found a customer and maybe your facilities aren't quite ready? And I mean, does it work that way or not?
So Michigan's a little bit of a unique bird. It's, if you look at it, I'm not going to pick my hand up and do the Michigan thing, but it's peninsula, right? So
Okay.
you have to think like, okay, well, where's the power coming from, right? It's not, like Nebraska or Oklahoma, which are kind of embedded in this sort of bigger ISO. It's peninsula. So as part of that, like we have to demonstrate we have the resource adequacy within our service territory within Michigan to serve the load within Michigan.
So we're not pulling it off the wires from somewhere else.
So we do have import capacity. I think it's estimated right now about 3.5 gigawatts we can pull into the state. But it's an important point that you're making here is that, we do have flexibility to pull in some imports. But our perspective is so conservative that we're assuming that those imports can't be relied upon when we serve our customers. So we're making sure like we can serve, we have the resources in the state that match the load. They're ours. We have access to it. It meets the resource adequacy requirements that we need to make sure that we can guarantee 100% we're going to serve this load.
And this is going to be a terrible question if I'm far off, but when you say imports, do you mean imports from other states or imports from Canada? Is there anything coming down from Canada at all?
So it'd be mostly imports from other states. So we are kind of exploring what that looked like to come down from Canada. So we've got a couple hot dogs on the fire on that one.
It became 10% more expensive for about 3 hours, and then
A couple Border Patrol people, everything's called.
right, and then everything's good. Nuke. Let's spend a little bit of time on Nuke because you mentioned it as consistent and clean, or not intermittent and clean. And I may get these numbers wrong, but it's going to be 20%. Nuke is 20% of DT's generation stack as of 2027. Do you want that to go up? Do your data center customers want that to go up? How do you make it go up? Talk to us about that. Would you have to have plans in place now to be turning that capacity on in 5 years or 10?
Yeah, so those are all really good questions. I think the nature of nuclear development is really complicated because it's, so the way that at least our utilities set up is that our resource planning process is sort of like this near to midterm, like 3 to 5, 6, 7 years out, right? So a lot of the nuke stuff is much farther out.
Yeah.
How do you demonstrate, a need for that today or a pathway to going and building those things, right? So it's a little bit of a challenge to even have the conversation around it. But for us, we have a operating nuclear power plant called Fermi 2. It's just over gigawatts.
Just over
Just over a gigawatt.
a gigawatt. Yeah. So it's one of your 11.
Yes, right. So
Yeah.
if you think about it from that perspective, so fantastic asset. But the interesting piece here is we also have we're one of the few people that has an existing license to build another nuclear power plant, Fermi 3, which would be co-located right next to that Fermi 2. So minimizes your NIMBY issue. Not my backyard, just to an extent.
Right.
Welcoming great community in that area. It's for a 1.5 gigawatt GE economic simplified boiler. Most likely it's going to be one of those, it's going to be a Gen 3 traditional. So you're looking at a very, very long lead time on that asset. If we did
What does very, very long mean?
well, I think with the Southern Company's local 3 and 4 units, they had 15-year plans. It ended up being like 25, 30-year plans. So that's a good question. Very, very.
But I mean, it's decades.
It's decades, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But we do have the opportunity to leverage that license to convert it to an SMR license.
Okay.
which
SMR is
small modular reactor. So you think like scaling these things down, pump them out of factory, costs come down. So at least that's the concept around it. But most of this, there's hundreds of technologies in this space. There's only a few of them that are based on existing technologies that kind of give you a little bit more or a little bit less heartburn in the technology risk for these. But these, those units, call them 300 megawatts, kind of is where we're kind of landing on some of the units from Westinghouse or GE that are the ones that the people feel most comfortable about in the SMR space. So we have the opportunity, we could convert that 1.5 gigawatt license to house some SMRs.
to 300 megawatt.
Yeah, 3, 4,
SMR.
5, depending on the layouts, which is a major advantage for us in terms of the timeline. So I think we're still working through what our nuclear strategy is and what it's going to look like long term. But I think we've got one of the most interesting locations, I think, in the U.S. in terms of utility, where we've got an existing operating nuclear power plant where you have the expertise for it. We've got a license on a co-location in a community that's supportive of nuclear. We've got these potential data center load coming in to support, this nuclear development, to sort of matching it and hit these long-term, clean goals for folks, 10 years out or so as we accelerate the data center load. And lastly, we've talked to some capital providers, and there's a lot of appetite to support these projects from a capital, infrastructure fund, folks that are looking for these big, large projects to invest in. And I mentioned before, there's a couple technologies that are considered a bit de-risked. So these folks are interested in getting into that market, and they're willing to deploy capital and uncertainty around licensing time periods. They're, interested in being able to build out the supply chain when in parallel to kind of deliver these things faster. And if we use our existing license, that could have a recipe for a very quick deployment of an SMR. Now, the problem on that is that, these are going to be first of its kind, and there's going to be costs. So you got to think through how do we handle that? The cost issues of the first ones being more expensive. And is that something that someone's willing to pay for? Maybe data center's willing to do it. We don't know, but that's going to be one of the challenges we'll have to think through again.
I'm smiling at you as you're answering some of these questions, and I'm thinking to myself, what is 2021 you thinking about right now when you flash forward to 3-4 years ahead, and you're going from oil and gas, and now here we are talking about what type of
SMR.
SMR is right. Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, it's like I said, utility industry is like this interstitial of something very, very interesting.
you're touching everything.
Right. Yeah, and you opened with the sleepy remark, and I don't think we're sleepy. Maybe
No.
some of the utilities are.
No, you're in the
they're
thick of it,
sleepy,
man.
right?
You said potential, the license, does that say 5 years, 3 years? What do you think a license takes to get a license in the nuclear business these days?
A minute.
Yeah, it takes a while. I'm probably gonna butcher some of the ranges on here, but I think the technology license itself, some of the technology providers think that they could get the license in 2 years after filing,
Okay.
if it's based on an existing technology for some of the units. In addition to that, you would also have to apply for a license for the location.
Yep.
So that's another timeline you got to deal with, right?
But you have that yourself.
So we have that.
Mhm.
So we would have to yeah, I'm probably butchering the mechanics here, but I think there's a license amendment process that we can do that'll save us quite a bit of time on that.
Mhm.
It could reduce it from maybe 2 years down to maybe a year and a half. Or
Okay.
again, I'm throwing numbers out here
Yeah.
without, but there's some advantages to that, right?
Yeah.
It's really mostly around the fact that we've done like environmental studies and things
Right.
like that we're able to leverage.
So what does that mean? Could you be, if you started an SMR project in the middle of 2025, when do you think you could be producing electricity for a customer from that project?
Yes. So I'll tell you, whatever I say is going to be wrong. Like
Of
by
course,
people,
yes.
right? So I think hypothetically, and if we did find the right folks to partner with on
Yep.
this, in terms of end use, and had the right, regulatory process in place to support this, I think, we would partner with a technology provider. We would dovetail into their 2 years of licensing. We would start the process, licensing for the technology to get it
Mhm.
approved. We'd start the process to amend or whatever we need to do to change our license to. That's kind of done in parallel. So I'd say, call it 2 years for that whole process. Then there's another 3 years or so for the supply chain, where they got to build these factories and be producing the units, right? So call it another 3 years. Now, if you were able to sort of do that in parallel with these capital providers that are, very interested in like getting into this space and willing to put some capital at risk, you may be able to do that in parallel with your license. So I think, if you think about the long pole in the tent here, it's really that building out those facilities to kind of pump out
Yep.
these things. So, aside from delays, once you've got the license, you've got the factory, it's probably 24 months. Again, no one's done this yet, but 24 months to assemble these. And I don't say construct because you're not constructing them. 24 months maybe for assembly. So you stack all that stuff up and like, barring everything goes right, you could possibly, and you have the right technology provider, you could probably be looking at SMR in 2031 starting, FID, end of this year in theory, right? Again, don't hold me to
Yep.
these numbers, but it's beginning you're going to have the most expensive one that's ever built. But
Right.
You're going to build the first one.
The thing that
But you'll
strikes
have it.
me about that, Josh, is I think about fast as, how fast can I get back to my office? It takes
Right.
me 20 minutes. And you're talking about assuming everything goes right and caveat, and it's 6 years. So the folks who are bullish on gas because gas can go faster, there's some legitimacy to that simply because of it's not clean, but it is fast. And sounds like we may have all of it. May have both. We may put these things in motion and
Even if you called it 10 years instead of 6, by the other comparisons for the full, he was talking about 25, 30 to 30
Yeah.
years on some of these other programs. That is
or
fast.
15, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yep. But it's also just the tip of the iceberg. So if you think about 35 gigawatts growth by 2030, what is that by 2040? What is that by 2050?
Yeah.
Are we going to add hundreds of gigawatts of load? Possibly. I don't know what that world looks like, right? And if you think about what's going to serve those long term, out to 2050 or 2060 or wherever, you have to think about what are the constraints on resources that exist today. Like we're going to run out of land and land for solar and good wind locations. There's only so much natural gas that can be pumped out of the ground. But if you think long term, the only resource that's really unconstrained is going to be nuclear. And maybe the one constraint on nuclear is we're going to run out of people to like run these nuclear plants if we start building them. But there's no constraint on the resources, the fuel for nuclear. There's plenty of uranium. If we run out of uranium, we can use thorium to make more uranium. It's everywhere, right? It's in the soil. So if you think about what's actually an unconstrained long-term energy source, it's probably going to have to be nuclear.
Nuclear engineering. You heard it here first. Our college age.
On my face.
Yeah.
He's going deep into a lot of different.
College age listeners better be thinking about that.
Right.
I did the math. In 2060, I'll be 93. You know what? I will not care about the power projects at that point in time, but I do care now. Where do we get smarter on this? Where would you suggest we look, Justin, in terms of, resources, books to read, websites to follow? Is it some government something? Where do we go?
Yeah, utilities, I'd recommend, just trying to get smarter on utilities. Steve Fleischman has some good materials out there.
Okay.
He's just some analysts across the industry, usually pretty spot on.
And Steve
Steve
is
Fleischman.
publishing. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So I think if you read a lot of his stuff, it'll kind of hit on the EPS stuff that we talked about earlier too. He's focused on like what do the earnings look like.
Right.
But
He's at Goldman, right? Is that right?
I forget where he's at now.
Okay. We're
Yeah.
both. Josh is Mr. Figure It Out. Okay. So you like
Yeah.
Steve Fleischman as a resource?
Yeah, pretty good. And if you're looking for nuclear, Titans of Nuclear is a good podcast to watch. A lot of interesting concepts in there. And then if you're trying to learn more about data centers, I think probably a good one is I butcher his name, Dvarksness or Dvarkesh. Interviews a lot of some of the big tech CEOs and folks like
on
that.
data centers.
On
Okay.
data centers. He interviews a lot of folks, but there's a lot of good conversations. There's one good one with Zuckerberg where he talks about some of the challenges around how much generation is going to be available for data centers long term, things like that.
And that was two names, Dvark.
It's a DWARKESH, I think.
Okay.
Dvarkesh.
Okay. That's good. That's helpful. Josh, what else do you want to hit?
Said Wolf Research, would that be?
Yes, yeah.
Steve's a Wolf.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right.
Okay, there we go.
Good.
Yeah. Internet.
Josh is the man. And you know what's fascinating? So the last big tech boom enabled him to source Steve Fleischman's location in seconds, right? I mean, that was the internet bubble and the internet build out. And we're in the middle of one now with AI and data centers.
He's got a phenomenal,
I love it.
professional pick here.
There we go.
The reactor there.
That's
He
good.
knows what he's doing.
Yeah, we're excited about the growth. We think it's going to be a great vehicle for the state economic development, as well as for our customers, which come first for us as well. So sure, we're excited where this is going. We're excited about partnering with the data centers and the future for DT.
Yeah.
This is his first podcast. I think he killed it.
Yeah. Well done. Although
Yes.
you've never killed a podcast till you've answered the last question with a lightning round.
Unfortunately, this determines if you come back or not.
Yeah.
So good luck.
That's right. Okay. Justin, the rules of the lightning round are single words or, short answers only, yes, no, etc. But it'll be a way to help us get to know you a little bit better. You want to start?
I do. Dan, I want to commend you too on your list here is getting better and better.
Good.
You're doing
Thank you.
great. This is a hard-hitting question, so good luck to you. Ready? Perfect. Hamburger or steak?
Hamburger.
Work from the office or work from home?
Office, definitely.
S&P 500 for 2025, bearish or bullish?
Bullish.
Grammy winner Beyonce or Coldplay?
I'm going to go Coldplay on this one.
Wind or solar?
Wind all day from the north, so we love
Okay.
wind.
Cash or crypto?
Never hold cash.
Will coal use in the U.S. fall 10% or more in the next 5 years?
Fall more.
Okay. Does the Ukraine conflict continue beyond year-end 25?
Yes.
The Godfather or Shawshank Redemption?
I did not like The Godfather. It insists upon itself.
Okay. That's Shawshank Redemption. NVIDIA long or NVIDIA short?
Long. All day.
Will the world hit net zero by 2050?
Yes.
I'll do this one real quick. AI, will it remain contained, or Terminator is a real possibility?
I think there's a lot of bad actors out there. We're going to see some weird stuff, but I don't think we get to Terminator level.
Okay.
Okay. This is the key question. Will the Houston Texans make the Super Bowl in the next decade?
Asked a couple Uber drivers that, and it was not it was a bad outcome. So I'm gonna go with no. So
nice.
I love you, but I don't love that answer. All right. Justin Edmiston, Director, Growth and Acquisitions at DTE Energy. We really do thank you for being here. The website is www.dteenergy.com. We'll have you back on in a couple of years to talk about what's happened and how things have changed. Thanks for being here.
look forward to it. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah.
Our pleasure. Thank you very much, the audience. If you have any questions or comments, get a hold of us on any of our social media channels. Dan, as always, just a stud. Thank you,
Josh.
for setting us up here.
That was
great.
fun.
Great time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.